How's it going? This is part one of our series called Judgmental Christians. If you want to know more about what this series was about, feel free to watch the intro video if you haven't already. It was right before this one. We're going to be looking at the question of should Christians judge other people or not? And we're going to actually be looking at a part of the Bible that I don't think really gets that much attention in a lot of sermons. I've been going to church since I was a little kid, and I don't think I've ever heard a sermon preached on this passage. What we're going to be looking at is a letter that Paul wrote, the Apostle Paul, or Saint Paul, you might have heard of him as, to a church in a city called Corinth. And so he's writing this letter to a church there because in the church, there's this open example of basically incest. There's a man who has married a much younger woman, and his son is actually sleeping with the woman as well. And to make matters worse, this is not like a secret thing. Everybody in the church knows about this, and no one really cares. They actually think because of their faith in Jesus, they're basically free to do whatever they want. And so Paul is writing this letter specifically to them. And this would be the example where we say, should he judge them or not? What's going to come out of this? We're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, if you want to pull it up on the Bible app, if you have that on your phone, or feel free to just Google these verses. All right, we're going to start with verse 6. This is Paul writing. Your boasting about this, meaning the man sleeping with the woman, is terrible. Don't you realize that this sin is like a little yeast that spreads through the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast by removing this wicked person from among you. And then if you're following along, you can skip down to verse 9. When I wrote to you before, I told you not to associate with people who indulge in sexual sin. But I wasn't talking about unbelievers who indulge in sexual sin. I wasn't talking about unbelievers who indulge in sexual sin or are greedy or cheat people or worship idols. You would have to leave this world to avoid people like that. I meant that you are not to associate with anyone who claims to be a believer, aka a Christian, yet indulges in sexual sin or is greedy or worships idols or is abusive or is a drunkard or cheats people. Don't even eat with such people. Now listen to this part, verse 12. It isn't my responsibility to judge outsiders, but it is certainly your responsibility to judge those inside the church who are sinning. God will judge those on the outside, but as the scriptures say, you must remove the evil person from among you. So there are two big takeaways from this passage that I want us to look at. We're going to look at one this week and then one next week. The first one is this. If you are a Christian, it is not your responsibility to judge someone else who is not a Christian for anything, period. If you have a friend who is sleeping with their boyfriend or girlfriend, or who is living a lifestyle that you don't agree with, it is not your place to impose your Christian standards on their life. Paul himself says, it isn't my responsibility to judge those outside the church. And this is Paul talking. He founded Christianity in many ways and wrote almost half of the New Testament. If it wasn't his responsibility, it's not your responsibility, and it's not my responsibility. If you are listening and you are not a Christian and you have been judged by someone who is a Christian, know that that person was going rogue. That person was not following what the Bible says, was going against what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians. People do things all the time in the name of Christianity when in fact a lot of that stuff is not condoned by the Bible or by Jesus. You probably have known Christians who have actually cut people completely out of their lives because of something that they were doing. A non-Christian friend does something that they disagree with so much that they're like, I can't even be friends with you anymore. But just know that Paul, even in these verses, is saying you should not cut ties with people who disagree with you. Cut ties with people who are not living by your Christian standards. Because he says if you wanted to cut ties with everyone who didn't live that way, you would literally have to leave this world. So whose responsibility is it then to judge people outside of Christianity? Paul says it's up to God. And so when you hear people say, hey, stop judging me, only God can judge me, Paul would agree with them. So I said there were two big points that we were going to take away from this passage. We're going to look at that one tonight, and then this is the one we're going to be looking at next week. It comes from verse 12. It certainly is your responsibility to judge those inside the church who are sinning. So we will come back to that next week, but we hope to see you this Tuesday night at 7:15 p.m. Central Time to talk through this.